border. Despite a tourist travel ban, long lines to enter the U.S. continue, stretching for miles.
Debut novel. What? First of all, congratulations. What an
Thank
accomplishment.
you.
That's, I mean, so amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so weird. It's mostly weird.
You know, so I was wondering if you wanted to start with a reading or if you just want to hop right into discussion, like whatever way.
Yeah, we can hop right in, I think.
You're not gonna read for them, for the people?
I mean, I can.
I think like maybe just a little bit, not to prep for you, but I would love for people to just get some of the language of the novel in their ears, because you do such great things with sentences. Like,
well, thank you. Okay, so I will read. There's a section. Oh gosh, there was a section that I was going to. I'm so sorry. There was a section that I had bookmarked and then got lost.
It's totally fine. It's like that. Sometimes I've done readings and they'd be like, are you gonna read? I'd be like, yes, because that is a part of my job. I have prepared.
Right. Totally prepared. Okay, yes, I found it. I'm very prepared. Okay. So so this section is it's just a very brief moment when Maggie, the main character, whose mother has died and she's arrived home. She is coming into her childhood bedroom, and I'm just checking to make sure are there any names in this that are important to know who it is? No. Okay. Maggie sits in her childhood bedroom for a moment, on the single bed her parents never agreed to graduate her out of. She isn't out of breath, but she feels she has to catch it. She isn't dizzy, but she needs everything to stop spinning. She isn't jet-lagged, has never been jet-lagged, but she feels like daylight savings has just happened and that she's flown across the Atlantic to boot. Her room looks nothing like her anymore. It's a reflection of a past self. On the wall above the bed are taped up pictures of an androgynous Johnny Depp torn out of the teen magazines she would buy. Until recently, he was the one exception to her disinterest in men, but when she found out he was an abusive asshole, she had to let him go, not without regret. Beside Johnny are pictures of women, Uma Thurman in Kill Bill, Gwen Stefani in her most punk No Doubt phase, Janet Jackson pre-Justin Timberlake Super Bowl. There's a hole in the center of Gwen's picture from where the poster was ripped out of the magazine, cutting off her cocked hip. Don't you want to take those down already? Her mother had asked the last time Maggie visited. It's been long enough. Almost a decade. At the time, Maggie had tightened up, had answered something sarcastic or glib or possibly mean. She can't remember, but she knows her mother thought it was silly that this room remain a shrine to her teenage self. Maggie didn't know how to explain that she found comfort in her unchanging room. She liked the teenager she'd been, the raw newness of discovering her desires, the things that made her angry, the causes she became passionate about. She doesn't think high school was her happiest time, and she's pretty suspicious of anyone who thinks it should be, but she knows she was more open then, more willing to extend herself. Everything else shifts, changes, moves, grows up, and dies, she thinks now. So why not keep one thing the same, especially if it isn't hurting anyone? She takes a deep breath and lets herself sink back, her conversed feet still on the floor. Just for a moment, she thinks, and shuts her eyes.
Oh, thank you for that reading. I know exactly what I was thinking when I was reading that section. I know exactly where it was and what I was doing. And I remember it so vividly because I too had this moment of like coming across a picture of like a young Johnny Depp and being like, ooh, I kind of get why he was like a sex symbol. Like, wow. Because like I've only ever really known like Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah, it's very different.
And then you find out all the bad things about him and it's like, oh, well, that was a short-lived love affair.
Yeah, people keep telling me maybe he's been uncanceled. I don't know. I don't really care. But like,
Before we get to like the first question I have for you.
Yes.
One small note about that. I once tweeted about Johnny Depp. I once tweeted that sentiment that like, oh, he was hot, but now he's a terrible man, so he's can't. And his fans attacked me for 3 days on Twitter. Had to go private. It was a nightmare. But so
Yeah.
my first my first question for you about this novel is about the structure. You know, there's a braided structure shuttling between Maggie in the present and Iris, her mother. And my question is like, did the idea for the novel arrive with that structure already sort of baked in, or was that something that you came to as you were drafting and maybe revising?
Yeah, so I didn't really know at the beginning how it would be structured, except that once I sort of knew that I would have Maggie going home and that there would be this sort of, this liminal space of mourning, I knew that it would take place over a few days.
Yeah.
But I didn't know yet that I would be moving between the present and the past. And it wasn't until I sort of realized that I really wanted to give readers, as well as myself, a chance to explore Iris's past, not through Maggie's prism and not through her sort of judgmental eyes, that I realized I had to include some of those moments. And I'd already been writing Maggie in the present tense, and I don't even know why, but when I was doing that, and then I realized that, oh, this is perfect, because now I can write Iris in past tense, and it has a very clear then delineation between like the present, past, on the verb level, and it was helpful that I found that structure, because as I've said before, I'm just excited when I have a plot with this book.
Like I relate to this on a very deep level because my novel starts in past and then switches to present and then back to, so like I was like, yes, I understand what is happening here and I understand why, because sometimes it's nice to just like escape present tense. Like it's like you're drowning sometimes because you're like right up against it with the character and there's no wiggle room for the writing.
It's true, but I sometimes get so tripped up in the past tense because I get really caught up in the grammar situation of like, okay, but if it was should I do past perfect now? And how long do I have to stay in past perfect if I'm doing the thing that was before the thing? And I know that like there's slippage and you can sort of, there's a way that a lot of writers do it where they go into like past perfect to demonstrate that, yes, we are now in the pre-past of the regular past. And now I'm going to go back into the regular past. And you're going to still believe we're in the pre-past, but it just trips me up. Yeah. So I found it was easier to write in the present versus the past.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's easier when you're in present tense to write a flashback. Like it's just so much easier. Yes. It's just like the grammar, the calculus of it is so
exactly.
Simple. But the trick I learned in fancy writer's school is 2 in, 2 out. So if you want to do past perfect, you use 2 hads, and then you can just do regular. And then when you need to get out of that, you drop 2 more to remind us that we were in the
right. But it's like, because it's cheating, it's like there's part of me that I think it's that math thing that you just said, the calculus of it, right? It's like I feel like I'm cheating when I'm doing that, and that I'm like dropping a plus or a minus somehow, and like the equation is going to get screwed up.
Yeah, no, it's one of those like unglamorous parts of being a writer when like sometimes you pick a tense or a point of view just because it saves you so much extra calculating down.
Absolutely.
But I guess like sort of tracking back a little bit. So did you always know that Maggie was going to go on this kind of epic journey in more than one way, sort of journey physically and also of self-discovery and discovery about her mother? Or did that sort of, or were there false starts? Like, did you always kind of know that like that Iris was going to die? That's not a spoiler. It's like sentence 1, maybe.
I mean, yes, literally sentence 1, because that's the thing that came to me first, right? Was this first sentence. I mean, I know that that's really rare, and like, it's bizarre to me that it happened this way, but it really did, where I was, I had one of those things where I was awake in the middle of the night and I couldn't sleep, and I was starting to try to write a sentence in my head. And I mean, you know how it is usually when that happens, I mean, if you're like me and you don't get up to write it down, which I usually don't because I'm lazy and tired, and even when I'm not able to fall asleep, I really want to sleep, so I don't get up. Usually you forget it by the next morning, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't forget it, you remember it and it's bad.
Yes.
And if you've gotten up and written it down and then gone back to sleep, you also usually get up in the morning and find out it's bad. But this was one of those bizarre moments when just like I was rewriting that first sentence in my head, and I just knew it would take me somewhere. And so in the morning, I actually did remember it. And it wasn't exactly like the first sentence in the book, but it was very nearly what the first sentence still is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think Ariel's name wasn't there yet, but other than that, it was what it is now. And because of that, I knew, you know, okay, so Maggie is a queer woman and her mother's dead. And that was sort of where I started.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like the first sentence, as it currently is, kind of contains the entire thematic thrust of the book. Like the whole book,
Yay,
kind of.
yes.
Like it's all like you kind of know what you're getting into with that first sentence, both in terms of like the range of concerns of the book and also like what's happening at the like sentence, like syntax level. Like that first sentence kind of contains the entire universe of the novel. You have this like family, this very peculiar family geometry butting up against this character's like sense of herself and her sexuality, and the sort of embedded, like the embodiedness of her queerness, and all of that is just like colliding with this horrible moment of family tragedy. You know, like it all just like collides so beautifully in that first sentence. And yeah, it's kind of amazing that it was like the seed. You can sort of trace almost everything back to that first sentence. It's really remarkable.
I mean, and I think that's why it stuck with me, right? Because something about the idea of like the way that sex and death just sort of meet in that sentence was, I think, what really stuck with me. And I mean, not to get too like Freudian, but something that I remember, when I was in college and I was reading Freud for a psychology class, you know, I thought a lot of his ideas were kind of like, eh. But I really liked his writing. I mean, and I still think that like, if we're going to read Freud, I mean, yes, he's the father of psychoanalysis and like the field has grown from him, et cetera, but his writing is really beautiful a lot of the time, even if I sort of disagree with a lot of the ideas. And I remember reading about sort of like the life drive and the death drive, and thinking how interesting it is that those things seem to often work in tandem in people's lives. And so subconsciously, I think that was something I've been thinking about sort of in general for a long time. And it just found a spot in that sentence.
I mean, not just in that sentence. I feel like this whole book is about the sort of collision of like life, like the desire to sort of like not only like live, but to sort of really like sample of life's like sensuous pleasures, and also the imminence of mortality. But we shall get to that. I have so many questions about the sexcapades of this novel. But sort of trailing off from there, my second question is like, so like one of the animating structures of the book is like secrets, both the secrets that we keep for ourselves with our friends, and also those secrets that we keep from our families. You know, like even in like a family, like the characters in this novel, no one's really being entirely forthcoming about, you know, their relationships to each other. And so as a result, like when Iris meets a grisly fate in the early part of the novel, a set of events unfold, and those events are essentially like a fact-finding mission that Maggie goes on to find out like what has her mother been doing all these years, and like what are the reasons for all of her mysterious like bequests and things. So I guess I was wondering, like, can you talk a bit about this like really interesting tension between who we think of ourselves as and like who our families think of us as, and also like the roles that secrets play in families and in relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, you write about this a lot too, right? Like this idea of unknowability, right? I mean, this is something that I loved in your book, is the way that, I mean, not to get too off topic, but just the way in which your characters sort of grapple with this idea of trying to know another person, and how even when we try very hard, we can manage up to a point, right? I mean, and this is something that I'm always thinking about in my life, right? Like, just as a sort of another example, my partner and I think in very different ways, right? So like, I will sometimes think about how differently we think. And that is one of the ways in which we're very different, is that he will never think about how differently we think, because that isn't something that occupies his mind, and it is something that occupies my mind, right? Like that fascinates me, the idea that we can love someone whose mind works in such a vastly different way than ours. And so I think that that's just sort of being human, right? And trying to be around and love other people is sort of acknowledging or not acknowledging, but dealing with the fact that different people think in different ways and live in different ways, even when they love each other and care about each other. And so I think that often what that means is that even if there aren't purposeful secrets in families, there's always stuff that's hidden, right? Like there's always going to be stuff that you just don't know, that is just not, you're not privy to. Like even if it's just a lie of omission, where, I mean, because how many of us, if we grow up with our parents, you know, what do we know about our parents? And when do we start to learn to ask more questions or to extend our own empathy or imagination into what their lives are like or would have been like? I mean, and I think that this is sort of common across experiences. And so that has always been really interesting to me. And I think is something that I also, definitely something that sort of, as I grew older, thought about more and more and saw in very different ways around me. And the ways that sort of different people grapple with their families, whether that's their family traumas or their family, you know, their good families, right? Like it doesn't really matter how good your family is or how bad your family is. There's always going to be parts of it that you just don't understand.
Yeah. I mean, something that I found really interesting is that, so like there are many moments in the book where Maggie comes across like kind of petulant, you know, like in a way, like moments when she's kind of like, she's feeling her feelings and she's like, I have a right to feel this way. I don't feel like, I know I'm not being rational, but like, darn it, I deserve answer, you know, like moments when she's sort of feeling a lot of frustration. I mean, I don't even think it's petulance. I think it's frustration. She feels frustrated by the fact of her mother, by the fact of her relationship with her mother. And she didn't really understand why her mom treated her the way that she treated her. And you kind of, like the novel, you sort of get to see her come sometimes reluctantly around to this place where she's kind of like, oh, I guess like that's why she was like that. I guess that's why she did that. I mean, I still don't like it, but I understand my mom was X, Y, and Z. And I feel like part of the novel is this like really interesting, you know, like she's already come of age, Maggie has, but you kind of get to see her come into a different kind of maturity, which is like empathy for her mother, who, you know, they didn't have an easy relationship. So could you talk a little bit about that tension? In the book?
I mean, I think it's, the way you put it is you put it really well in that it is a different kind of coming of age, right? Because I think that, you know, there's one kind of coming of age, which is just, I don't know, becoming legal, whatever that means, right? Like attaining a license, or, you know, being able to vote, and the sort of the legalities of what it means to be an adult, and the responsibilities that we have as adults. But I do think that there's a whole, I mean, there's a whole different ball game of things we have to deal with emotionally.
Yes.
And I think that you can be an adult who, you know, is paying their taxes and has a job and does their own groceries, and who can still come home every Christmas or whatever and be a child, right? I mean, how many people have that experience, right? Like where you just, when you go home, you somehow revert back to a childhood self, because it's natural, I think, for many of us to just sort of be mature in all sorts of areas of our lives, except in that place where we were formed. A friend of mine recently compared, she was talking about how she and her husband speak to each other when they're angry and frustrated. And she said something about how, like, we both just need to understand that, like, when we're frustrated, we're both 6 years old again. right? Like we all revert back to something when we're being triggered by something that we don't even know is triggering us, right? Like someone reacts a certain way and it does something to us that reminds us of something, and we don't always know how to make all of these links. But that idea of like, you know, us being sort of children again around our parents in whatever way that is. And again, this also can be the other way around, right? Like some people were made to be adults very early, and so they become adults around their parents in a very different way than they are adults in their other life.
Totally.
So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how for Maggie, you know, she grew up in a very privileged environment, and so for her, she got to be very much a child with her parents. She got to have a teenagehood where she could slam the door and, you know, throw tantrums and smoke pot and like get yelled at about it and whatever. And so she needs to grow up in a very different way when her mother dies. She has to realize sort of all of the things that she comes to realize in the book. I mean, which I don't think her sort of growing up is finished, right? But she's starting to get to somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, by the end of the book, she's kind of like, okay, I don't understand everything still, but I understand more. And I'm not like on board with it, just so you guys know, but like, right. We're getting there, you know, like it's a kind of, I mean, there is a kind of maturity that she accumulates. And, you know, often the book makes this point of, you know, like Maggie was the one of her friends who had a job and who had a 401k and benefit. Like she has like the most boring job in the world, which is like insurance, you know, like her whole thing is like risk aversion. And she's sort of so angry that she's good at it all sometimes. And so she is incredibly mature, except when it comes to her parents and her brother. You know, like there are so many moments like this breathtaking scope, like where the paragraph starts, they're sort of thinking through these very adult thoughts, like I need to do this, this, and this. And then like the minute a family member enters the paragraph, the whole tone changes. And she goes, and why can't they just do what they're supposed to do? And why can't they just behave in the way that they're supposed? Like she's so angry that they're just behaving childishly that she herself reverts to like, you can almost imagine the 15-year-old Maggie just on fire and mad that everyone's being unreasonable. And I think it's handled so incredibly well. Like she does fully revert like when she goes home. I kind of want to ask about I guess this sort of maybe more nerdy, crafty, writery question, which is objects. This novel's super interested in objects, you know, the letters, of course, that she is tasked with disseminating, the amber necklace, the engagement rings, the car, cell phones play a really important role too, mugs of tea. Like there's so many objects and they have so much meaning, like at a sort of capital S story symbol way, but also like they mean something really specific to the characters. And part of the novel's pleasure is like watching the characters' relationships to those objects change as they sort of go through the obstacle course that you've set up for them with the plot of the book. Like, you know, the amber necklace means one thing at the start of the book and a very different thing at the end. And the rings, her relationship to the rings are different. You know, the letters mean different things at different points of the plot. And of course, you know, I would be silly not to mention that many cultures have rituals and ceremonies and traditions regarding what one does with objects of the deceased. You know, there's an entire, humans care a lot about what we do with the objects belonging to deceased people. And so this novel just seems richly charged with objects. And I was wondering, like, you know, like, what do you make of the narrative power as an object? Like, what is the pleasure of that as a writer? And also, like, is that something that you were interested in and tracking when you were writing the book?
So I think a lot of that probably was sort of unconscious, because I think that I definitely have, as a person, very strong relationships to particular objects that is very sentimental and not particularly rational, and is sort of superstitious in a way that my very rational self would find ridiculous, right? Like just, yeah, you know, like my family has had a tradition for, I mean, I don't know how long it's been, but there's a tradition where when you leave the house for a trip of some kind that's like longer than, you know, just leaving the house, you leave a mug in the sink. So that the reason is because then you come back and wash it. So it's meant as dirty mug, right? Like you leave a dirty mug in the sink because that way you must come home, obviously, because you can't just like leave a dirty mug in the sink forever, right? You have to come back and wash it.
Yeah.
So I think that probably subconsciously that was playing around in my mind. But in terms of the sort of the deliberate objects that I was purposefully thinking about, the amber necklace was sort of a later addition. It wasn't there in the original draft, but it was something that came a little later when I was thinking about wanting to integrate sort of another layer of another generational layer into the story in a way that would make it feel like there was a sort of a little bit more of this connection going through the women. And so that was when I started doing some research about what it could be and sort of thinking about where these people came from and how they arrived in this country, or where sort of Iris's side of the family arrived from. And so I found that there's amber that is called Polish amber. And that was sort of how I came to the object of the amber necklace. And the letters were very much very tied to me, to Iris's character, and to the sort of way in which she perceives herself as like the heroine of her own romance novel in a way, right? Like it's a dramatic gesture, and she wants to have those dramatic gestures because they make her feel alive in some way or special. So I was thinking about them very much in that sort of Jane Austen-y kind of letters kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love Jane Austen. So
I do.
I think one of the moments I really liked most in the book, and I don't think this will spoil anything, but it was like when Peter says of Iris, "Oh, your mother, she was very romantic," you know, like that. And I was like, she was romantic, you know. Because she lives this like, by sort of outside, you know, perspective, she lived a very interesting life, but you know, because we do get to inhabit, you know, moments in her point of view, like she does have this incredible sensuous like appetite for life and for love, and she is incredibly romantic, and I just thought like, yeah, he really understood he really understood Iris. Like they really were simpatico. I kind of, speaking of Iris, I want to ask about her. So I think my favorite parts of the book were all of Iris's sections. I loved her sections. They were so like rich and so deeply imagined. And the thing that I loved most about them, you know, like it's so rare that we get to read in fiction about a woman who isn't essentially a glorified teenager experiencing sexual appetite and desire and physicality. And this novel just like does not shy away from her sort of whole life as like a full, complicated human being with a sex drive. And not just like a sex drive, but like a desire also for romantic love. And like she's such a rich appetite for love and for life. And so like, what was that like, sort of sitting down to write that? And I guess like, what do you think about our sort of collective cultural imagination for like what is possible in the lives of women who aren't, say, like 18 sexually and romantically in fiction?
Right. I mean, and this is the thing, right? Like I'm very bored of our cult of youth in society, right? Like I find it both sort of distressing and disturbing, because it sort of means that like we're all, I don't know, doomed the minute we exit our 20s or something. Yeah. And also because of sort of all of the implications on like what it does to self-image and to just young people's sort of worth, and ideas about like what it's like to get older. And also just I'm I find it exhausting. Like as a reader too, I start to wonder, like, when am I going to start being turned off of books that are about 20-year-olds? Like I'm nervous about it, you know, because that might happen. I mean, I hope not, because hopefully there'll be good books written about 20-year-olds, but I also want to read books about older people, you know? And I know that they exist. I know that there are books about women who are older experiencing sexuality. But I haven't encountered a ton of them. And that's definitely at least partly a flaw of like how I've found my books and my reading, right? Like I've just not found them or looked for them hard enough. But it's also obviously then a flaw of like, how easy is it to find them?
Totally.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so I really wanted to just think about and explore a woman who's at different times in her life, but is still sort of a vital, vibrant body, right? Like her body is not shriveled.
Yeah.
Just because it's aging, it doesn't mean that it has stopped wanting things. It doesn't mean that it has stopped feeling things or feeling alive or feeling desirous. And I mean, I think also that she, you know, her life gets cut short at quite a young age, and she wouldn't have been done anytime soon, you know? Like, I don't think that her dying at 63 is intended to show like the full range either. It's just that sort of, that was the range at which in this plot that worked. But
right.
yeah, I just really wanted to look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was just like really, I mean, I thought it was one of, you know, like part of the tragedy of her death is that she's like cut down in the midst of her living, you know, like she is fully alive and fully like experiencing new things and new sensations, and she has regrets and she has rekindled things. Like she's so alive and in the midst of living when this tragedy happens. And I love how the book attends to that. The book so fully attends to her like physicality as a person. And I just, yeah, I really like that part. It was really fascinating to me. I have one more question for you before we get to the Q&A, which is one of some of the parts of the book that made me laugh. It's not just like a sad book, it's also a sexy book, and it's also a book with some interesting road trip writing that I really liked. But there are also so many moments of humor, and some of the moments when I laughed the hardest was when Maggie would like get told again and again, it's like, oh, you think your generation invented this, or you think your generation invented being queer, or even just like, moments of like even sort of not only sort of friction between different queer generations, but even friction within within her own generation because of things like class and privilege. So like, was that fun to write about all the prickly different ways of being queer and putting them in one book and letting them sort of vibrate and bump up against each other? But also like what drove you to sort of want to put not only like a queer character in this book, but like a fully realized queer community? It felt like this is not just like one queer character in isolation. This is a person with like a network and a community, you know, in her life. So like, what was that like, putting that on the page?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in that the community aspect, which is that I do think that we often see, I mean, and this is getting sort of less and less true, right? As queer literature has so wonderfully flourished and like gotten to live more. But I think historically speaking, at least, we've often seen queer characters very much in isolation, right? In terms of like friendships or networks. And as queer people, I think we know that to survive as a queer person, or just to thrive as a queer person, maybe is a more accurate term. To thrive as a queer person, we often rely on our queer communities, and that those can take vastly different shapes and vastly different forms. But you know, whether that's a sort of chosen family that is very tight knit, or just a wide network of people that you know, or whether it's an online community today, right? It's something that we often rely on and turn to as a way of sort of feeling normal, right? Or just feeling like we're not freaks, or not, you know, not this other.
Yeah, totally.
Of course. Yeah. And I mean, but of course, at the same time, I also am very aware of sort of there being people who get to have more community than others, or there being people who get to sort of thrive more than others. And I am fascinated by my own sort of self-righteousness when I was younger in certain ways, which was often sort of just the way that when I would learn a thing, I would then become self-righteous about it. Right. And I think it was partially just like you're nodding because you recognize this. And I know that.
Oof, yeah. Oof.
And I think that that's a defense mechanism, right? It's like look, I have specialized queer knowledge now, and thus I must project it into the world with a self-righteous manner. And that's fair. And I think many of us go through that period of time before sort of, I don't know, mellowing or becoming nuanced or just embracing nuance, or as with Maggie, I think specifically learning about our history. Right. And I think there is a sort of way in which many of us come into being with a very ahistorical sort of sense of the history of queerness. And we feel like there is no history, when that is obviously false.
Yeah.
There is history. It's just not been given to us in a way that we can see always. Right. And so reaching back into that history is very interesting to me and important, because I feel like it's one of the ways that we learn how to move forward. And it's also one of the ways that we don't like fracture, because there is, I mean, like any community that is marginalized in any ways has fractures because of all of the sort of trauma that has been created inside of it and imposed upon it, so that then it's very easy to like turn and become like the infighting is what the way people talk about it. Right. And I don't know if it's infighting so much as just like, when people have sharp corners, those sharp corners bump against each other. And I think that if we learning more about our histories is a way of like getting stronger and softening those corners, and remembering that we can act or finding ways those corners can fit in different ways, like a puzzle somehow.
Yeah.
And also Maggie as a queer white woman was someone I wanted to look at that, to look at like her privilege and her class and her race, and like how is she in the world in ways that are sometimes very unaware and sometimes overly aware, and and sometimes that's sometimes her over awareness is very uncomfortable, sometimes her unawareness is uncomfortable. And I wanted to look at that because I think that is true to a white racial experience, which is something that we, when we talk about racial experience, we often make that mean not white people, as if like whiteness does not have a racial experience, when that is just not true. Like, obviously that's not, or it should be obvious. It's not obvious maybe, but it should be. So I'm very interested in like trying to deal with the white racial experience, partially in order to like demystify some of those icky, uncomfortable moments, in order to also like, I don't know, get white people to stop like living inside of white guilt and talk about things, so that, maybe we can stop killing people.
That would be nice for all of us.
I mean, but that's like a very long-term goal, like I think that's a little ambitious.
Maybe not this book, but your next one will
right. There we go.
We have some questions from Facebook that I'm going to ask you, but I just wanted to say, like, as you were talking, it made me realize that like your whole quest to sort of integrate queer community and to sort of resolve this sort of tensions is so directly also the project of like Maggie figuring out how to be in relation to her family. It's like she learns the history of her family and realizes, oh, I joined a conversation that was already happening. Like it's all the same. Also, just wanted to say, I just realized this novel is kind of like a multi-generational queer saga in a way, because she meets so many different queer people from different generations. It's great. This novel has it all. So this is from Rabia from Facebook. I felt as though you were queering the genre of the road trip novel. Was that intentional? Were you trying to break any norms?
Oh, I wish I could say that I was. I honestly was just really excited that I had a road trip, because like that helped me have a plot. So I wasn't like thinking of the road trip novel as a genre so much as I was thinking of a road trip as a vehicle for plot and movement that is literal and thus literally moves us forward. So I don't have to think about how else do I move the plot forward. I just get in a car and she moves. It's great.
It's great. Yeah, I love that part. You know, there's also the other great queer road trip novel, The Price of Salt, or Carol. It's also a great road trip novel.
This is true.
But I do love the sort of, I feel like road trip novels are all inherently queer as a form, because you're like on a journey, you're all these like hidden in between stops, you're between two destinies, like all of it, it feels very.
Do you think the Odyssey is a queer road trip novel?
Well, for
or
so
a queer
many
road trip epic poem?
For so many reasons, the answer to that question is yes, that we don't have time to get into, but absolutely. There's so much gay stuff in that poem.
I mean, yeah, so there's the Greeks, right?
I
So pretty
think
gay.
that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
as a rule. So this question is from Lewis from Facebook. What did you learn while writing this novel? What didn't you learn? You know, you learned it all.
Yeah, I mean, oh man, that's an interesting question. Thank you. I learned that I can write a plot. I learned that I enjoy writing. Well, I learned again that I enjoy writing women who are older than I am, a lot. I learned how to use, I learned a lot about astrology, not on purpose, but because I needed to for research.
I love that part where she, I won't spoil it, but there's a great bit about astrology in this novel that I screamed. I was like, oh, but that makes sense. I can understand why she would do that. But also, oh my God. It was great. I'm glad you put that in. It was, I don't know how much research you had to do, but that part was gold. Let's see. We have a question from Anna. Did you pull from your own relationships with family for Maggie and Iris's relationship?
So for Maggie and Iris's relationship, not at all. The book is literally dedicated to my mother, and it says like that she's not the mother in this book, and that was very purposeful because I had this whole sort of nightmare scenario in my head that people would assume that this was autobiographical, and that then they would go up to my mom and start asking her questions about who all of the sexy men were that like she'd been cheating on my dad with all these years and they'd never heard about.
Oh my God.
But I mean, I definitely drew on just, you know, other aspects of myself, but I wouldn't say that it's particularly autobiographical. So I think there are sort of aspects, just, you know, human relationship aspects, but there's no one-to-one.
Yeah, I mean, I also recently published a novel, and I mean, I guess in my case, I kind of had it coming. I did call the novel Real Life, but like people are like,
yeah, but they also keep saying Brandon Taylor, who was also a biochemistry you know, MA at
yeah. They do a lot of, they're like, someone said it had the intimacy of memoir. And I was like, that's just called good writing. Like,
right
here.
But you knew that was going to happen because they always do that. They always,
yeah, I mean, I also called it Real Life. Like it was not, you know, a surprise. But I do think that that's true, like in writing, right? Like you kind of gather up all of the relationships you've ever had in a life and you sort of like remix them and handle them, and that's where a character kind of pops out of, you know, like it's never usually
right, it's not conscious.
People. Yeah, I mean
it can be conscious sometimes, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, totally. I mean, autofiction's a thing, you know. We have a question from Michelle. I kind of I want to know the answer to this one. Was there anything you edited out of the novel that you regret?
Ooh, you know, I don't think so. I think that everything that was cut was like totally fine to cut.
I guess
honestly.
Well, natural follow-up, did you cut a lot? Did you leave a lot on the cutting room floor?
No, not that much actually. Mostly, I mean, there were little things that were cut, sort of like to like over exposition stuff. Or I think I had more about the insurance agency at the beginning and sort of like took that out, more like insurance language that was wonderfully ironic that we sort of like took out because it was as fun as it was to play with. It's sort of like, it was maybe too much, you know. But no, mostly actually what ended up happening was there were some scenes I had to add once I'd sold the book and I was working with my editor at Dutton on it. There were some things that she wanted me to add, which I was really excited to actually get to write, because once we talked through those ideas of sort of like what she wanted more of, I was like, ooh, I get to invent like new bits. Especially it was all for Iris, so it was fun. I got to get new Iris stuff.
That's so great. That's so amazing. Although now you have your second book, can it please be like an insurance company novel? Because like I love novels about companies and like insular groups. I mean, obviously you know this, like insular groups of people. An insurance company just strikes me as like a really ripe place for parody. And
for parody, oh my god, the language that they use, it is hilarious. It is all so ironic. It's like, how do you not realize that what you're saying is just like, it's just waiting for, you know, an Office Space remake, but about an insurance agency.
I kept thinking about the language for indemnity and like tragedy because there's a moment where she's thinking about it on the flight home, and I'm just like, Maggie, like, what are you doing your life? Yeah, I mean, so we have a question from Sarah from Facebook. What would you tell MFA students not to do in their debut novel? Yes, Ilana, please give me all the advice.
Okay, well, the caveat is that I do not have an MFA. So, you know, first of all, that's just something that needs to be said. I think in general, don't write the novel that other people want you to write. Write the novel that you want to write, the novel that you need to write. Don't write the novel that like your professor is pushing you to write, or that your friends think would be so awesome if you'd write. Because like, even if it would be, and maybe you have that book inside you somewhere, sometime, you know, like, I know people want me to write. I mean, I know because people have said this to me, like, people always want me to write, like, oh, write the Israel novel. And it's like, no, I'm not there yet. I don't know if I'll ever be there. It's way too complicated for me. It's way too upsettingly personal and like weighty and political, and there's stuff. So yeah, no, write the novel that you need to write, that you want to write, and figure out how to market and sell it later. Like, don't think about that while you're writing at all. That's for later. That's the editing process.
I mean, one might argue that it's even like downstream of that's for your publicist and marketing to
right, but like how to find the agent for it sometimes is a different kind of selling you have to do, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I keep making these jokes about the Craven story of like the poor Black family in Alabama novel that I'm just not going to write because I have self-respect. No way.
You don't want to write that, so you shouldn't write that.
Here we go. This is an interesting question that Haley has asked us. I would love to know more about your ideal creative space when writing. Is it the same? Does it change? What objects are near you? Is there anything specific you must have with you when writing? I like this because it's basically what I asked you, except it's not in the novel. It's like writing the novel.
Right. Thank you, Haley. So, I'm very bad at rituals around my writing. So I'm very much sort of I write whenever I can, which is never enough and never as much as I'd like to. But ideally, I found that I really, really love being able to get away from my regular space in order to write. So like, I've been lucky enough to be able to go to some residencies, and what I love about that is that it's this compact time that is far away. I have none of my shit with me. Like, on purpose, I don't have all of my stuff, so I can't get cluttered, and I don't get distracted by like the things in my house and the million books that I have to organize and don't have time for, and all of the work that I have to do, right? So not having my stuff is actually sometimes the best way for me to write, is just like being away in some way, and being in a different space can be really inspirational just because it's different.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, mood, like biggest moods. Yeah, when the cafe is closed, I was like, how am I going to get any work done? I can only write when I'm not in my own apartment. I'm gonna really suffer. Okay, so this is from Leah. How did you, oh, this is a great question. How did you balance your reading for book reviews and your work on your own novel? And did your critical writing inform your fiction as you went?
So thank you for the question. I'm sure that my critical writing did inform, or not my critical writing, I'm sure my critical reading, just all of the reading that I've been doing over the last few years, I'm sure it did inform the book in some way, whether that was in terms of like structure or plot. I don't know, sort of consciously speaking, how it informed it, because I can't draw that line, partially because for a while there I was just reviewing so much so often that like I wasn't able to sort of keep track in that way. In terms of balance, I didn't balance those things well in any way at all. So I wrote the book in very short spurts over time, where I had like a month here and then a month there and then another month there and then another month over there. And in between I was thinking about it, but not doing the writing. And I'm not very good at balance. That's something I'm trying to get better at. I'm quite a workaholic. And I don't recommend anyone live like that. It's not been good. Just to be very frank.
I think I saw that in one of your interview answers where you were like, well, my work-life balance is terrible, first of all. Yeah. And I feel like I know that just from the frequency of your byline, and also from being your friend. I know that about you.
Yes. I mean, I'm also on Twitter very often going like, I'm so overwhelmed.
Big mood, biggest of moods. We have time for one more question. And it's one of my favorite questions. What books are both of you reading now that you would recommend?
Ooh.
And I guess I can go first and give you some time to because I know you're reading 8 million books. So the book that I'm reading right now that I'm just like deep inside of is I think it's called The Chiffon Trenches by Andre Leon Talley. And it's a memoir. And he, for a long time was like the highest ranking Black man in all of fashion. He was Anna Wintour's #2 for a really long time. He's this incredible fashion personality who has had a wild career. It's just, and so you're getting all this dirt on all the big designers, and he was friends with everybody. And it's so gossipy, but it's also so personal and kind of heartbreaking in a way. And it's just so rich and entertaining, and it's so good. So In the Chiffon Trenches by Andre Leon Talley. It's a perfect audiobook because he reads it also. It's been a great companion the last few days.
I love how everything you just said was like a little mini thematic novel, because you said you were deep inside of it, and it's called In the Trenches, and then you said that it was like very gossipy and had like all this dirt on all these people. So like there's dirt inside of trenches usually. So it was like beautiful. You were so thematic, Brandon.
That's your critical lexicon jumping out. You're so attuned. So what are you reading that you would recommend of your 8 million books that you are reading?
Yes, well, some books that I'm reading right now are sort of for research, and one of them I couldn't finish because it was so bad. But the person's dead, so it doesn't matter. If people like see that on my Goodreads or whatever. But what I'm reading right now, well, I just finished Zaina Arafat's You Exist Too Much, which comes out in a week and a half. Yes, so not next Tuesday, but following Tuesday, and that's really, really good. Definitely recommend it. I'm also reading Laura Bogart's book, Don't You Know I Love You, which I have read parts of, and I didn't read the whole thing, but I'm doing an event with her next week. And so I wanted to like finally sit down and properly read it front to back. And I'm so into it. The imagery is so beautiful, and just like the character is an artist, like the main character is an artist. And so the way that all of the imagery in the book is constantly reflecting this, like the way that she thinks is really beautiful. And the sort of the visual imagery is so not how I think. And so I love that kind of visual rich imagery. And I'm also reading, oh gosh, it's Sierra Crane Murdoch's book, which is a true crime sort of investigation about Lissa Yellowbird. And I'm not remembering the title. I know it's called like Yellowbird, and then there's a colon. And I'm listening to the audiobook of that.
Oh, love audiobooks. You can just take a walk or social distance and just go down a deep rabbit hole. I think nonfiction is perfect for audiobooks. They're so
exactly.
It's so good.
Yes, I don't know that I can do fiction. I mean, I have, but I really am enjoying, because this is a new thing for me, audiobooks, but I'm really enjoying the nonfiction audiobook thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just consume so many histories that way. It's so great.
Right.
But yeah,
then it's also kind of like listening to a podcast.
Oh yeah, right? It's like having friends. Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah.
Those sound good. I gotta get them. I gotta get those books.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the last question.
All
so
right.
I think before we thank the audience, you wanted to do an outro?
So, well, I wanted to thank you, and also thank the Strand, of course, for hosting this. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. It was great to do this. And thank you, Brandon, so much.
Oh, thank you for asking. I'm so glad we got to do it together.
And thank you, Sabir, for organizing and just being our trusty, wonderful Strand bookstore organizer. I saw your event last night, and that was wonderful as well. So I'm looking forward to continuing to view the various events, and everyone who is here should keep coming to these events. Now,
totally. Yes.
No, thank you both so much. Thank you, Ilana. Your novel is marvelous. If you haven't, to the attendees, if you haven't already gotten annoyed with me for dropping the link perpetually in, buy the book. If you don't buy it from us, we won't say anything. Just buy the book and read it. And so thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.